universities do have a separate application process for their support programs, and that's okay too. So I do recommend just early on getting that information about each individual program, what's involved, what they do to support, and interviewing the people to make sure it sounds like something that would work for that student.
No, and that's so important. I can't tell you, sometimes we have so many students that come in and says, oh, I'm not going to talk about my learning disability. I'm afraid of the stigma, or they're going to not want me there. And like you said, the stigma of that's of like beginning of, last century or middle of last century, things have changed so much. I think if you go in a regular classroom, you see a good chunk of students with learning differences, and amen to that. We want different learners. We want different styles. That's how we get so creative. I had a student who did not talk about their learning differences and omitted that. And this person had to work so hard in all their classes, got waitlisted. I'm like, okay. And they chose not to because of all the pressures from the outside voices of other people saying that. And I said, okay, you're on the wait list. You have nothing to lose. It's your choice because it is confidential. This is your superpower. Despite it all, look at it. And they went for it and they got in. Because you're right. And, all odds against them because it's waitlist is not easy. And this was pre-COVID-19. So I love how you said about interviewing for that school, right? It has to be a marriage that works well for everyone. And if you're not going to tell college a part of who you are and they're not going to support it, why go there? Exactly.
That's so true. And I think one of the biggest parts of my job on a long-term scale is that reducing that stigma or eliminating it altogether is really, really important to me. So I talk openly about my own ADHD. It helps me connect with the students, and I try to just create this policy of talking about where we're at and how we learn. Of course, I would never force a kid into something they weren't ready for or force them to disclose their diagnostic information when they don't want to. But just encouraging kids to talk about the way in which they learn, how they study certain material. I use audiobooks. I work with Miss Galetta. She dictates to me and I type things out, or I dictate to her, she types it. Just talking about all these strategies that they use to normalize working outside of the box. Right?
Yeah, the mask needs to be removed. So John doesn't know this. So I'm also a parent of some kids who do have learning differences. And when teachers come and contact me like, oh, thank you for telling us, or thank you for being so open. I'm like, well, why wouldn't I be? We have to make sure this works, and we have to work as a team, right? So, and it's different, right? When they're, John also doesn't know how many kids I have. So for my younger one, you're going to need to be more of that, that flashlight so that they could kind of point out and say, hey, am I guiding my kid the right way? Is this working? Is it not? Whether maybe the medication working or too much work or lack of sleep. I mean, there's so many variables. And then for my older son, it's more of, okay, you need to learn to do that. Ask for the help, But if you struggle, let's strategize. Let's think outside of the box. And I think, I remember there was some experiences where one of my kids says, oh, because this person has a disability, they can't do this. And I'm like, no, they can't. And they blew the teacher away. Now, and this is not at SI, but, so there are going to be some biases, but one thing is on the application process, or even if a student does an interview, you could blow people's minds away. I know in the Learning Center, I see the kids who devote all the extra hours of work, right, of second guessing themselves. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you promote that healthy self-image, because sometimes I see students who overthink about the process, I'm not good enough, when they're like, oh my God, you're so great, it's okay. They work so hard to overcome their learning differences and not really see all the treasures they have along the way. So how do you work that in, and how can families and if students are listening, they could do it themselves as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really try to do is I try to encourage the students and the families as much as they can to provide balance to their student. So if reading is challenging for them in a normal classroom setting, yes, they may have to have a tutor, but make sure that whatever they have a strength in, they also have time for that. So a lot of parents will say to me, my kid is just got an F on a test. I think I shouldn't let him go to basketball practice this week. And it's like, my perspective on that is maybe for a week, but don't pull him from something that he loves because this is hard for him, right? So if you can really help them pour their energy and their heart and soul into things that are strengths for them, that can really build them up, because too often the kids are hyper-focused on the academics that are challenging for them. They spend more time on it because they need help with that. But then that sort of becomes their reality, and they feel that that's the only thing to them is this disability and this struggle. So focusing energy elsewhere is really great. The other thing that I like to do is if the kids are struggling in a certain area, I like to try to teach it to them differently. So, for example, I've had kids come to me who say, I'm not a math brain, just as you were mentioning earlier on. I'm not a math brain. I just can't do math. So we'll talk a little bit about why that is untrue and just what we know about elasticity of the brain and brain growth. I have some books that I use. I have multiple at different levels for different age groups, and then I'll try to teach it to them in a different way. So I've done trainings with multisensory mathematics instruction that has things color-coded, and so we'll do that, and then they'll be like, oh, my gosh, I can do this. I do have an ability to do math. I just needed to do it a different way. And so I want them to feel empowered that, that they can say, I can learn math. I just have to learn it this way, right? And just kind of flip that script in their minds.
Oh, no, and I think that's so important. And then the nice thing is with students thinking about colleges, there's so many different methods out there, right? There's more colleges that teach by doing, right? Or there's ones that do co-ops or it's internship programs, right? Like a lot of students focus on the name brand versus, well, this is what I'm really good at. So let me focus on this energy. I remember I had a student who was not going to do anything STEM and, just did take advantage of the Learning Center, did find out this late diagnosis and had these great talents in language and social studies and you name it, all the humanities. And I'm like, well, why don't we just focus on that? They're like, oh, no, but I need to take what everyone else is taking. And I said, what did I tell you about being a cookie cutter, right? Yeah. They all look the same. Don't. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Like, and I do think kids put a lot of pressure on themselves to figure out what college they're going to go to, what their major is going to be, and what their career is going to be for the rest of their lives. And I just told a parent today whose daughter is struggling with this. I said to her, listen, kids these days are going to live to be at least 100 years. I said it is unreasonable to expect a person to decide what they want to do for all of those years when they're 18 or 17 years old. That is unreasonable. So I try to unburden some of that pressure and say, I want your college experience to be one where you are living and you're learning. And your career is likely going to be in line with something you have a strength in or something you enjoy, right? There's a reason I didn't go into engineering. It's because I hate math and science, right? So I tell them, what's your favorite subject? And then we kind of explore majors from there. And I just feel like relieving some of that pressure is huge for them.
Oh, no. Like there's so many kids who just don't, people focus so much on the name and they don't see so much what's out there, like data science, right? Where they are maybe kids who loves computers, and data science is like what a webmaster was back in the old days. Like what is that? And it's a very up and coming. It's called Facebook, right? Like it's how to track people. And then, the reason why there's so many people in the world who come to the United States to study is because we do allow students to explore. Right. And often they don't look at all the curriculum, all the different classes. I was talking to a student, one who's a current student and alum, about interdisciplinary studies. Like you create your own major. And doesn't that make it real, right? Because, you may want to be in the business world, but you want to learn some graphic design and you want to do some filmmaking, which someone in marketing will be using. And I spoke to an alum who's actually older than you, and he literally was saying, all this hoopla about these big name schools doesn't matter. I work for a huge hedge fund, and I work with so many people from so many different colleges.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And it's like, it's about who you are. And that's, promoting yourself and your joy and that self-confidence. And he's actually like, I was just following, the hedge fund where I'm like, I want something more. So he's actually going to explore a totally different industry. Because he's following that passion, right? So I love how you put that, and the more all of us could say there's just so much out there and take the labels and the mask away, the better. Now, I'm going to ask you to see if you have some crystal power reading powers out there. So right now there is a movement of tests optional. And anyone who works in the Learning Center historically before has spent hours of helping students, whether it be getting accommodations, whether about trying to find those accommodations and getting all these agreements. So what is your take regarding about test optional, and what do you think this means for those students who have learning differences?
So this is a really interesting question because for the longest time I have absolutely hated standardized testing as a method for deciding which of your students are going to, or your applicants are going to be successful or not. And I am glad that students are starting to eliminate that. But the test optional thing is tricky because a lot of people are still worried that schools are going to have sort of this implicit bias or this blind judgment that they're not aware of leaning more towards kids who have the standardized tests than kids who don't, and thinking that, oh, well, why didn't they take it? What's wrong? So my preference is that we don't use standardized tests at all, actually. I would prefer it if we used other measures. And I think this is it's more fair.
Now that, as students get identified of having a disability and they're going to be blessed with having someone like you to give them that toolkit to use their superpowers, how to learn what works and what doesn't work for them. It's important for them to understand how to continue that when they go into college. So what are the tips you have of finding those schools? Because every school, even if it's a public school, which has a common policy for everyone, it has a different feel, a taste, a blend. So what is the recommendations you give for students?
So I usually tell students first off to, go on the school's website and find their program for kids with disabilities. And every school should have one. If you see a school that tells you they don't have one, I'd say that you would probably want to steer clear of that school. And then I would also want the students to know that you have rights. You have rights that are given to you by our federal government for what you can get in the way of services at a school. However, those rights do vary whether the school is receiving federal funding or if it's a public school, all of those things. So I would strongly encourage students to know their rights before going into it. And if they need help finding out, they could go to the special education teacher at their school or their learning specialist. So students at St. Ignatius would come to me, and we can kind of go over what they have a right to when they move on to college. And I think that's just the most important thing so that they can advocate for themselves when they transition to college.
Now, I've looked around, and you probably would know than I would. Like, I could get a list of top colleges have the best food, top colleges that have the best support program for campus pride, etc. Is there a list for really like the top schools or colleges for learning support programs with students?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are some websites would you recommend?
Honestly, you can just go to Google and type that in, top universities